Round 9 of the FIDE Candidates tournament, and in this video I'm going to show you the game of the day. It is played between Vidit and Hikaru Nakamura, an extremely exciting game with a lot of complications. In this video I'm going to show you all the ins and outs of that game. But before I'm going to do that, I would like to thank you all for the birthday wishes. I had a great day. And that was also because of a lot of new subscribers joining the channel. So once again, thanks for that. But also, you know that it's never too late to send belated birthday wishes. So become a subscriber of the channel and I will show you the interesting moments of this FIDE Candidates tournament. We are almost approaching the end, but there are still some rounds to go. In this video, Vidit against Nakamura. Let's see. E4, E5, Knight F3, Knight C6, Bishop C4, the Italian opening, Knight F6, D3. And now interesting moment because, well, Vidit had in the previous round, the day before, the same position against Gukesh, who managed to win an incredible game. I wanted to cover it on the channel, but because of my other activities, I had no time to cover it yet. But who knows, maybe at some point I will try to catch up with that game as well. Gukesh played there the move A6, kind of a strange move. Here, Hikaru just makes a pawn move at the other side of the board, H6, which is much more common as it does prevent the knight from getting into G5 anytime soon, so you cannot hit the pawn on F7. But there's also another idea behind it. Let's see. White goes for the move C3, D6, castling kingside. And now, very often, you are looking for ideas to generate some active play. And one of the main ideas here is to play the move G6, followed by Bishop G7, castling kingside. And you do play this Italian opening more in the spirit of some sort of King's Indian defense. But instead of playing the move G6, here, Black goes for this move, G5, much sharper. And this move has become fashionable in the last few years. The idea is that, well, at certain moments you can kick the knight away with G5, G4. And White always got to think about it. I don't think that Black really wants to play that move immediately. But it's just that if White's pieces are not optimally placed, you can force the knight from F3 to go to an inferior square. Well, enough said about it. Here we go. Knight BD2, Bishop to G7. And here, for instance, in a lot of Ruy Lopez Italian games, you know this famous plan of Rook E1 and get a knight around to the king side, to G3. Especially here, the knight would be greatly placed on G3 to cover these weak squares, these light squares on the king side. But problem with a move like Rook E1 is exactly what I've mentioned earlier. There will follow a move like G4, and this knight doesn't really want to go to H4 because it will be unprotected and there are some issues with that knight. But White has a different way of activating the knight from D2. He goes here for the move Bishop B3, also a very thematical way of playing. Black continues here with the move A5, so I guess the idea is to grab some space, maybe at the right moment you can get that pawn to A4. But before anything else, White just says, okay, I am placing the pawn on A4 myself anyway. Castling kingside. And here the knight comes into to C4. So this is the plan. The knight really wants to come to E3. But here Bishop E6 is played. And the bishop is of course greatly placed here, putting a bit of pressure here, also covering the light squares on the other diagonal. Here's the move Rook E1 and Black goes for the move Rook E8. So now let's pause here for a second, because I think the most obvious move here for White, the first move I considered at least, is to continue here with the move Knight E3. It was not played in the game, but your idea is to try to get some grip on these light squares. And even the exchange of bishops, it will definitely help White to gain access to the king side. However, the reason this move is not played Knight E3 is because Black has now the possibility to play the move D5. And the pawn is well covered by the knight, bishop and queen. And also the pawn on E5 will be well supported by the knight, bishop and rook. So let's go back. Instead of knight e3, white for the moment is keeping the knight on c4 to discourage black from playing the move d5. So white played here the move h3, stabilizing the knight on f3. White is probably not really fearing g4 to be played because it will also weaken black's king side. And now, as I said, the move d5 is not possible because after pawn takes, knight takes, here the pawn on e5 will be 3 times attacked and it's only twice defended. So white is gonna win material here after taking on e5. So let's take it back, but you understand that for now white is not interested in playing the move knight e3 and black cannot break free with a move d5, while the other pawn break with f7, f5 is also not possible. First of all, the knight is standing there on f6, and secondly, the rook has left the f8 square. So we do get to see some typical maneuvering at this point. Here we go. Queen d7. Logical move. White play the move bishop d2. Both sides are connecting their back rank major pieces. Rook a8. White played the move queen c2. And well, here in an earlier game, black played here this move, knight h5. I think that is in fact a very interesting move. You don't play it earlier because the queen has now left the d1 square. The knight is absolutely safe on h5, and it will be on its way to f4. Maybe g4 can be an idea later on as well. And black will try to get in some counterplay on the king side. Well, didn't happen. Black played here the move b6, protecting the pawn on a6 so that the knight will be free to move. Here, white played the move bishop to a2. And now, finally, something is going to happen. There are a lot of options. It's not forced by any means. I like a plan like g4, trying to open up the g file, and a very logical follow-up would be to move the king away and get a rook over to the g file. And who knows, there are some attacking chances. Of course, you're also weakening your own king side, but definitely black is looking for this kind of sharp, unbalanced position. But Hikaru goes for a different plan. He played a move knight h5. So now he goes for that plan, but the drawback is that now this knight no longer supports the pawn break in the center. So this is the moment the knight comes in to e3. You're controlling this square 3 times. If you do push the pawn on d5, you're just losing a lot of material. The knight is excellently placed here, controlling both d5 and f5. And well, also white is offering the exchange of light squared bishop. And it's always the question if white should at some point take himself, or black is going to take on a2. By the way, also another important thing, I know there are some gifted tacticians watching. If you're looking for this kind of typical sacrifice on h3, you're getting 2 pawns for the piece, but there are absolutely no mating threats. White is having everything under control. Knight on f4 doesn't threaten anything. Knight on e3 covers the g2 square. White is going to play king h1, rook g1, rook g3, and step by step kick the black queen out. So in any case, they follow the move bishop takes a2. In certain cases, it's better just to allow white to take. For instance, if you play something like knight f4 and then after bishop takes e6, you can take back with the f pawn and then you cover these 2 squares. Well, it was not played. Also here, I believe that white is a bit better. Potentially this bishop is better than the dark squared bishop on g7. But you want to see what happened. Bishop takes a2, rook takes a2. Rook is temporarily misplaced, but at the same time, white is getting a better grip on these 2 light squares. Well, black played here the move knight e7. It's one of the options. In hindsight, there's also the possibility to activate that knight from f4. This is going to be a recurring theme. I don't like that knight at the side of the board. Now it's getting to a much more active square. If white is ever going to play something like knight f5, then you want to trade off the knights and later push the d pawn. So white is not really going to jump in with that knight to f5 yet, but rather stays on e3 and maintain control over these 2 squares. Well, black played knight e7. I'm not a big fan of it. And here white has different ways of playing. But at some point, you should try to create open files. There are only 16 pawns on the board here still. No open files, and the major pieces are in desperate need of looking for some action. So a typical move here is something like b4. So white is asking black to take the pawn on b4 followed by a5, and you do create a passed pawn on the a file. That should favor white. While if you play something else, then probably white will take on a5 and play the move rook to b2 and look for an opportunity to hit the pawn on a5. So I think b4 would have been the best way of playing, but Vidit went for the other move, d4. And it is understandable, but this pawn break is not well timed. I will try to explain why, because black's pieces are well placed in the center. While the rook on a2, it still needs one or two more moves to get back into play. And with a move like d5, trying to strike back in the center, black is obtaining the perfect game to activate these major pieces. But it was not played in the game. I'm not sure why Hikaru didn't play it. Maybe he didn't want to allow these sort of simplifications. But in any case, he decided to take first on d4. And after pawn takes d4, now he played the move d5. But this is a big difference, because it does allow the move e5, and white is having still a nice space advantage in the center. And well, black will try to find ways to challenge these two pawns. But at least for the moment, these major pieces, they're out of play compared to the other line where black would have played d5 instantly. So now again, I'm really struggling to understand why this knight on h5 is still there. It should really try to get back to a more active square, like knight f4 with possibilities to come back to e6, with a blockade to control the pawn on d4, maybe support a pawn push to c5. Looks like a perfect game for black. Even the other knight may come to g6 at the right moment, especially if the knight goes away to g4, for instance. You just go knight g6, you protect your other knight, and the f5 square will not be used. So it's always this sort of cat and mouse game between these two knights. If this knight moves, then the knight from e7 is going to move as well. Anyway, black had a different plan. Played here rook c8. Is preparing the move c5. And, well, I don't think you should really fear that move. And white has something like knight g4, which is a great square for the knight in general. And it looks as if this knight on h5 is going to be stranded, because probably white is going to play g3. And where's this knight going? Anyway, it was not played. White played here rook a3, also a typical plan. So the third rank can be used by this rook. Let's see where it is going next. Still, knight f4 is an option, but black is playing very consistently by following up here with the move c5. Still, knight g4 is this sort of move I would like to see. I don't think after something like knight g4 you have to fear pawn takes d4, because the queen will move away, and later the pawn on d4 will be taken, and it's clear that white's pawn on e5 is much better than the pawn on d5. So white is having some sort of nice advantage, but both sides are not playing the optimal moves. D takes c5 is played, and normally you want to take back with a b pawn to have a nice pawn duo in the center, but in all these lines the pawn on a5 will become a weakness. You may take it now or just continue playing positionally with knight g4. But in any case, rook takes c5 was played, and still I guess that white should continue with queen b3, hitting the pawn. And because of that, black will have to defend the pawn, and then you continue with knight g4, and still the knight on h5 is very bad. But white played the move queen to d1, and now finally black is not doesn't have to worry here about the pawn on b6, and can finally activate the knight coming into f4. Excellent move. Vidit went for b4 to kick the knight, to kick the rook. And well, if you do take with the bishop, with the pawn and then with the bishop, then the rook on c5 is in trouble. You may trade off the bishop for the knight at some point. The pawn on d5 is a weakness. There's definitely some play here for white, and therefore Hikaru played differently. He went back with the rook to c8, but that's a pawn sacrifice, because white captures on a5, then the bishop takes there as well. But I think it was a very conscious decision. However, after knight c6, attacking the bishop goes back to c3. White is here still a pawn up, but things are pretty sharp, and black should try to use its main asset, the d pawn. But you cannot push it right now, because white is controlling the d4 square 3 times. You may consider something like rook c to d8, and then you will prepare this sort of move. I think white is still in control, and with some precise play, at some point you may regain the pawn on e5. But Hikaru made here a serious mistake. He captured the pawn on e5. After bishop takes e5, bishop takes e5. Probably he was expecting that white would take here once again, and everything is under control, materials even again, and probably black has even chances to play for more with a move like d4 coming next. This d pawn can become pretty powerful, but there is this fantastic shot, not too difficult, but it was missed by Hikaru. He just captures the pawn on d5, and that opens up the diagonal, sorry, not the diagonal, the file for the rook to hit the bishop on e5. Here, after something like queen takes d5, everything can be swapped on d5. You take on e5, and at the end of the day, you just have one extra little pawn on the a file. This is a technical win, as the pawn will be supported by the rook and the knight. Anyway, after knight takes d5, there followed knight takes d5, knight takes e5, very good. Now, white is having an extra pawn, and you would expect here a lot of exchanges, but since black's king's position is seriously weakened, white really wants to keep the major pieces on the board. Here it hits the queen on d7. The queen got a move, but where should the queen go? I was thinking about queen d6 to hit both the rook and the knight, but there's rook ae3, for instance, which is a very cute idea to support the knight on e5. Knight takes e3 is not possible because of queen takes d6. It's game over. So, in any case, queen d6 is also not going to be the equalizer. Black is in serious trouble here. Play the move queen e6 instead. But now the rook comes to d3, hitting the knight on d5. The knight should go somewhere, because if you protect it with rook to d8, well, there will be knight f3 with a discovered attack on the queen. Knight defends the rook. If queen goes away, you take on e8, and if you do recapture, it's rook takes d5, white wins the piece. So, let's go back. Let's see what happens here at the final stage of this game. Black went for the move knight f4, hitting the rook, but the rook comes to d6, attacking the queen. Queen goes to a2, but there is rook takes h6. That's pawn number 2, and that's not going to be the only problem, because you're getting more and more access to this king. Black in big trouble. Played here the move queen to b2, attacking the knight on e5, but very nice move here. It's queen d7, because the knight on e5 can't be taken because of queen takes c8, and you're winning material. And even more than that, after king g7, it is checkmate on h8. However, black didn't capture the knight. Got to do something about the threat of checkmate on f7. Played here the move queen to b3. So the queen defends that pawn, but the queen comes now into f5, threatening a check on h7, and that's also going to be checkmate very soon, because after king f8 it's knight d7, and the king is running out of squares. So black played here the move knight g6, but only hope here is that after knight takes g6, the rook on e1 is hanging. Probably even here white is still winning, but let's not get there. Why to sacrifice material when you're completely winning anyway? Well, one sacrifice is very cute. You can just take with the rook on g6. Forcing move, it's a check, and black resigned. In view of pawn takes, queen takes g6. When the king goes to f8, it is knight to d7 with checkmate, as the rook covers the e7 square. The alternative is to go to h8, but after queen to h6, you pick up the pawn on g5, and let's say the king goes back. You have 4 pawns for the exchange, which is already massive. But even nicer is that on the next move, you can get in your rook with tempo, hitting the queen, preparing the rook check on g3. This is going to be checkmate in your view, or black will have to give up a lot of material, and then he ends up in a hopelessly lost endgame. That is a very painful defeat, and I think it was completely unnecessary to lose with black in such a way. There were many moments in which I think especially Hikaru made some unforced errors, but probably after his spectacular win against Fabiano in the previous round, he got some wings, and he was probably believing that this was supposed to be his game. He was trying to play for a win, but it backfired. And that means that now both players are back on 4.5 out of 9, which is not bad, but they're not really in contention for first place at this point. But who knows what's gonna happen? 9 rounds have been played, 5 more to go. Let's see what's gonna happen in the next couple of days. But before we do that, please hit the subscribe button. That's gonna be my belated birthday gift. Thanks for doing that, guys. I really appreciate all the support, and I'll be back with more coverage of this fantastic event. See you soon.